It's a topic that has dominated the headlines. Accusations that the government was broke due to failure by the government to pay salaries and to honor its obligations. On Thursday, the issue made its way before Parliament. The National Assembly's Budget and Appropriations Committee summoning the Finance Cabinet Secretary.
Nobody was actually sure if the Cabinet Secretary for Finance was actually going to appear before a probe investigating the so-called cash crunch. After all, this was the second time that he had been asked to appear before this committee. While he did appear, the probe has been ongoing for the last 1.5 or so hours, although a lot of people feel that may not be enough to find out why the country is facing liquidity problems. Inevitably, the first question to be asked was this.
What measures have been put in place to avoid a current cash crisis in the country?
Let me, Mr. Chairman, say that there are no liquidity crisis as such.
The minister blamed the weakening of the Kenyan shilling on the strengthening of the dollar. He says the situation had been further compounded in the first quarter by a tightening of liquidity, the central bank raising its rates, and huge carryovers from the previous financial year, prompting this next question.
Can you just tell us where we are with interest rates?
Interest rates have gone up, and we've seen the market has become very liquid. Obviously, it will be irresponsible for us to borrow at a very high rate like that. That is why we have decided to substitute that domestic borrowing and borrow through a syndicated loan or borrow externally to avoid that until rates come down.
And inevitably, a question on Kenya's debt came up.
The committee is asking for a detailed information on the actual maturity dates for all the public debts in the country.
We know our debt levels are within, still sustainable at the moment. What we borrow is what we consider feasible and does not undermine our debt sustainability going forward.
Short on detail, but with a promise to provide a detailed outlook later. The appearance by the minister appears to have eased MPs' concerns somewhat. That will become clear once they complete their report on the crisis. Robert Nagela, CCTV, Nairobi, Kenya.
Now, the finance minister trimmed Kenya's growth forecast in 2015 to 6% from an earlier 6.5%, citing deteriorating growth outlook for economies around the world. The World Bank had earlier on Thursday cut its 2015 projections for the country to 5.4% from 6%. Now, to discuss the fate of Kenya's economy, I'm joined by Edward Kusewa, an economic analyst. He's based here in Nairobi. Edward, great to have you on the show. Now, this cash crunch has been blamed on the government's decision to put debt repayment at the top of its spending priorities. Is it time to change strategy? What's your take?
Yeah, well, I think it is important that the government should change its strategy. Unfortunately, whenever you borrow, you must repay. So I think the government has been forced to keep on doing its debt repayment because of the huge domestic and external debt obligations it has. So it has to continue repaying because, as you can imagine, anybody who borrows from any bank or commercial or any field, you have to repay. So the government has been forced to repay these debts because it made an obligation. But indeed, we need to create an enabling environment for business to thrive and for the government to be able to raise revenues. Otherwise, if that environment is not created sooner or later, then this cash crunch may continue for a period that is well not known for how long.
Now, Edward, the World Bank recently said Kenya's public debt, which has risen about 0.05% to 44.5% of GDP this fiscal year, remains sustainable. Now, do you agree with this? And isn't it sort of contradictory with what we're hearing in terms of Kenya's cash crunch?
Yeah, you're right. I mean, it's true what you've said. I mean, when you speak about sustainability, remember, it means that you are able to repay your debts. That is what sustainability means. But for the case of Kenya, for it to remain sustainable, it means that we have to staff some other sectors of the economy. It means that there are certain sectors that are not going to perform very well. So I don't really fully agree with what the World Bank is saying, that it will remain, that the debt position will remain sustainable. We have to repay our debts. And if we have to repay our debts and remain sustainable, then it means certain sectors of the economy have to be starved. And so it is not a sustainable project at all.
Now, in light of this, Edward, as the government delays the disbursement of money to government agencies at home and abroad, of course, these agencies are starved of cash. Now, in terms of the wage bill, President Kenyatta also has been promising to reduce this since he was finance minister. Now, what is the short and long-term outlook looking at these two areas?
No, this has been a very sensitive area as far as the wage bill is concerned. But indeed, it is true that the wage bill needs to be reduced. I think the government, and as we have transitioned into a new government with a huge bloated wage bill, I think we need to start considering areas that would not need institutions. For example, we have a lot of commissions, we have a lot of independent commissions that we could look into reducing those wage bills in the short run. We also have officers at the top level of the government that we could consider in reducing. But remember that the legislature has really been, working hard to make sure that the wages are not reduced, and the Salaries and Remuneration Commission has been having a hard time trying to reduce the wage bill. But in the short run, this is something that needs to be done. But if we look at the civil servants in their totality, then in the long run, by reducing the disposable incomes of the civil servants, it may not be very feasible in the long run, because it means you're reducing the income in the economy, and that does not augur very well with the economy in the long run.
Now, Edward, still on expenditure, Kenya's government continues to introduce new capital projects, yet not all ongoing capital projects will have been completed by the end of next year. Now, what options do they have as far as accessing money, and how does the Eurobond factor into all of this?
The Eurobond was a very good initiative of the government because we needed to finance long-term projects. We have huge capital projects in Kenya. We have the LAPSSET. We have the new railway that is being set, and that could only be financed through the Eurobond. Now, the problem with the Eurobond has been we have to repay interests to the people who bought that Eurobond, and that is what is increasing this huge public debt. So, while we still borrow externally using these mechanisms, in the long run, the public debt keeps on increasing, and that goes back to your first question, that the cash crunch is a result of the external borrowing and the external huge borrowing that the government is doing. And once you borrow, remember, you have to repay. So the Eurobond is a good thing. The projects that are yet to be initiated, I think the government needs to consider that some of these projects have to go on a go slow, and maybe think about, first of all, dealing with the initial projects and bring these projects into completion. Otherwise, this would be a big problem for the country.
Well, Edward, we have to leave it there. Thank you so much for joining us. Edward Kusewa is an economic analyst.